Good morning, Western Civ 2. This lecture, we're going to be talking about the space race. And the space race refers to the Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for dominance in outer space. Now, you might wonder why in the Sam Hill were two superpowers racing to accomplish things in outer space in the late 1950s, the 1960s, the early 1970s. Well, the reason for that is twofold. One, it's technological. And that technological debate was over intercontinental ballistic missiles. An ICBM, the ability to launch a thermonuclear bomb from one continent to another. That meant sending the bombs into outer space. Now, they wanted to use missiles, to use rockets to deliver the bombs, because even jet planes took 10 hours or so to get from the Soviet Union to targets in the United States, and vice versa. And of course, even a jet bomber is a relatively slow plane compared to missiles that could be shot at it. Or interceptor fighter planes that could go up to shoot it down. Until very recently, a missile coming in from outer space, absolutely nothing you could do about that, until very recently. So launching your missiles with nuclear bombs at your enemy meant they were going to hit their target, probably, if you could get them accurate. So that was a big plus, but it required massive rocket thrust to lift very heavy bombs into outer space and then bring them back on a target on the other side of the Earth. And so part of what starts the space race was missile technology, the frantic need to get that done before the other guy. The other reason was the Cold War was in part a competition for the hearts and minds of the world, especially in Europe. Convincing Europeans in the East and Western Europe that, yay, communism is the way to go, or yay, free market capitalism and liberal democracy is the way to go. And showing your country could accomplish massively important things, world-changing things, was part of this propaganda war. But especially it impressed countries around the world beyond Europe. The countries, and we'll have another lecture on decolonization, but the European empires that had been built in the 19th and early 20th century fell apart in the 1950s and 60s. And these newly independent countries in Africa and Asia were looking, which way do we go, America or the Soviet Union? And again, this was a way to impress the audience to accomplish great technological things. So both sides were frantically working in the 1950s on rocket engines and the like for ICBMs and guidance technology. And the Soviet Union is the country that got there first. The first ICBM was launched by the Soviet Union early in 1957. And that really worried Americans, but we were close behind them. So as long as we could catch up fast, that wasn't such a big deal. But of course, that was initially secret. The Soviets did not tell the world that. What they did crow about, with justification, a remarkable achievement, occurred on August 21st, 1957, and that's what you see here. This is the world's first artificial satellite. This is Sputnik 1. It was launched by the Soviet Union in August of 1951, and it orbited the Earth for several months. It could be seen in a dark sky in the United States, and every time it went over, multiple times a night, people could go out and look and see this thing overhead and be reminded the Soviets can drop a bomb on us anytime they want. It was terrifying, as well as impressive, that human beings had now put something into space on a semi-permanent basis to orbit the Earth. And it had a simple transmitter in it. Actually, this is what was inside. It was essentially a radio in a ball with a power source and a fan to keep it cool. It didn't do anything vastly scientific. The mere fact that an object weighing more than 100 pounds had been put into orbit around the Earth was the scientific achievement. But this thing just went beep, 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 24/7 while it was in orbit. And it was a reminder to the world what the Soviet Union had done and could do, and what ICBMs launched by them could do. Well, the United States would frantically try to catch up. We would have several failures, but before we could even launch our first satellite, they launched a second, and it really was important. See this dog? It's a mutt. Her name was Laika, and that is Sputnik 2, launched in November of 1957. Before the United States had even put up a basic satellite, Sputnik 2 had launched carrying a dog. A complex mammal similar to us was carried into space by the Soviet Union in November 1957. And Laika survived for a couple of days. Now, in the end, she did die. She died of dehydration and stress, but mainly it got too hot and they didn't give her enough water, and she died because she got too hot. So they did learn you got to cool down the capsule better than they had. Obviously, you've got to give any astronaut that might come down the road more water than they gave her. But Laika became the first Earth creature to ever go into space in November 1957. Well, this is the one we finally did it, 1958. This was after a couple of very embarrassing failures where our rockets blew up on the launch pad in 1957 and 58. But we finally did put one up, and it's called Explorer 1, as you see there, in 1958. You can actually see it actually had cosmic ray detectors. It had different devices to measure temperature. It had a microphone on it to see if they could hear the pings of small meteorites hitting the thing. So it was a scientific instrument, more than Sputnik 1 was. But still, we were way behind the Soviets, and everybody knew it. The Soviets were winning the space race, and the world was very impressed with what they'd pulled off. In 1959, we would sort of catch up on satellite technology. Explorer 6 in 1959 would take the first photographs of the Earth from outer space and send back images to Earth. So, the weather satellites that we're so used to now is just par for the course. Their grandfather was Explorer 1, an American satellite launched in 1959. But we were way behind. The rockets the Soviets were building were much bigger, much better. Their technology and their capsules vastly better. And everybody knew that the next milestone was launching a human being into space and bringing them safely back to Earth. We launched a chimpanzee named Ham, in 1959 into space, and we brought him back safely. So unlike Laika, he made it back to Earth intact. The chimp Ham did. So if Ham can do it, humans can do it. But it wasn't us that did it. It was this man right here. This is the Soviet Cosmonaut, and in the Soviet Union, they didn't call them astronauts. They were called cosmonauts. This is Yuri Gagarin, Gagarin. This is the first man to go into outer space on April the 12th, 1961. April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin went up into space in a Soyuz, which means Union, I believe, in Russian, Soyuz spacecraft. By the way, you might have heard me mention in class what looks like CCCP to us. That's the Cyrillic alphabet that Russian is written in. Is actually SSSR. SSSR, the Russian for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics initials, USSR in English. Well, that's Yuri Gagarin. He did not actually land his capsule, by the way, so this was not a real picture of him coming out of the capsule. That's a picture of him going into his capsule before he was launched. Some technical problem developed after he orbited the Earth multiple times. And as he was re-entering, he actually jettisoned himself from his capsule and landed by parachute. Obviously, he was a fighter pilot. They all were in the early days. But he came back by parachute, so technically he didn't quite finish the mission. But the world didn't care about that technicality. He had orbited the Earth, I believe, 8 times before he came back. So 1961, the first man in outer space. The United States, again, frantically trying to catch up, would launch this man, Alan Shepard, In this capsule, the first manned space program in the United States is called the Mercury program. One man went up. His capsule is called Freedom 7, as you see there. And he later in 1961, about 6 months after Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight of the United States, Alan Shepard spent less than 15 minutes in outer space. He was launched from Cape Canaveral in Florida and splashed down off the Bahamas. So while he did go into outer space, he did not even come remotely close to orbiting the Earth. We were still way behind. The American who did orbit the Earth in 1962, a year after the Soviets pulled it off, is this man, John Glenn. He would later become a U.S. Senator. His capsule was Friendship 7. John Glenn in 1962, the first American to orbit the Earth. But again, the Soviets seemed to always be first in the space race. For the first 5 years, they were unquestionably in first place. And another achievement for the Soviets, this is Valentina Tereshkova. Valentina Tereshkova in 1963 became the first woman to go into outer space. She orbited the Earth more than 10 times and came back safely, actually landing in her spacecraft. So Valentina Tereshkova, Tereshkov, Tereshkova, Valentina Tereshkova, 1962, the Soviet cosmonaut, first woman in outer space. There she is actually coming out of her capsule. She made it back in her capsule, unlike Gagarin. The United States, though, did have a few things to crow about. And one of those things was our unmanned space program. The world was really obsessed with human beings in space in this period, but we actually were sending probes out around, as the Soviets were, into the solar system beginning in 1965. This is Mariner 4. This is the first man-made craft to reach the planet Mars in 1965, and it returned pictures like this one. Of the surface of Mars. For the first time, we realized Mars was pitted with craters. It also proved that the dream that there was life on Mars, intelligent life on Mars, little green men on Mars, was false. What some people thought were canals on Mars were just dark stains from darker soil, like over here. And people's imaginations had turned them into canals. There was still no way of knowing if very small life might exist on Mars, but Mariner 4 put an end to the idea that there was a civilization on Mars or that there was a lot of water on Mars. So, that was a disappointment. But the United States and the Soviet Union would continue the space race in the 60s. 1963 saw us putting several more astronauts into orbit. The Soviets then launched 2 men in a capsule. We would do the same with our Gemini program. But, and I should have actually gotten you a picture. In 1962, John Kennedy, President John Kennedy, who was totally committed to the space race, made a vow. He made it at Rice University's football stadium, so it's dear to my heart. But he made a vow in 1962 that before the decade was over, the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. Now, that seemed like an insane promise in 1962. The Soviets were way ahead of us in everything in space, it seemed, in 1962. All the big accomplishments had been achieved by them first. But Kennedy wanted to set a dream goal and try to talk America into accomplishing it. Now, that would become the Apollo program. And you all know we did it. On July 21st, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human being to set foot on the moon, and he and his colleague Buzz Aldrin were returned safely to Earth. But I want to make a whole separate series of lectures on the Apollo program because it really is very important. But I think that's good for introducing the space race. We lost the first laps of the space race, but we came roaring back to win the biggest prize of all. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. Good day.